Thank you. We are ready for this lesson, which will be the one of the most interesting lessons because we have today a real privilege. We have the privilege to hear Brian Walker-Smith, which is a pioneer in this because in his career are completely joined two dimensions. Is both engineer and law scholar. And so this is exactly what we try to do. We see the automotive law using many different multidisciplinary perspectives. And so we can say that he represents in his person this spirit, I think, and this idea of a multidisciplinary approach. In addition, I am so happy because this idea of this course, which is now the first course in the School of Law, started exactly 6 years ago because while I was looking something about the automotive and especially the self-driving cars, I was watching TV and I listening for the first time his interview on Right Track. It was a very interesting documentary. And so I was curious, and over time I started to know Brian through this. And he continued to be a sort of knowledge which was just from one side because he didn't know me, but he was not conscious of it, but he inspired this course and this initiative. When a few weeks ago in Geneva, in the United Nations Global Forum, we met personally, and so it was so kind in having the idea to be part of this course, just connecting himself today. But surprisingly, today we have him in person, and so I will give the word in a few seconds, but just to say, he's, as I told, lawyer and engineer. He also drafted a model law for automatic driving and also taught the first legal course dedicated to automatic driving. And so for this reason, I thought that he was and he is a pioneer in this because he started 12 years before us. So we believe to be pioneer in Italy, but we are 12 years late. And so we have the privilege to hear his lesson. I give immediately him the floor, but I'm sure that after the Lectio Magistralis, he will be delighted to hear your intervention, your curiosity, and so feel free to intervene, ask, and as we are always doing, we have an interactive lesson at the end. So thank you very much, and I give you the floor, and I hope this is the first one of many. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a warm introduction. You might be a few years late to the legal aspects of automated driving, but clearly you are 1,000 years early to legal education generally. I was asking a few of you beforehand why you chose the University of Bologna, and a few of you looked at me and said, well, because it's the best, obviously. And so that's quite an honor to be here at such a prestigious and historical place. I'm really looking forward to a discussion. So at any point, please speak up, jump in if there's something you don't understand or something that you disagree with, or if you have any questions. I think as your very accomplished professor noted, I will talk a bit and then we will really get into the heart of the topic. I will just note my thanks to you in particular for the work you have done in promoting the division of interdisciplinary education. There's so much we can learn from each other if we talk to each other across disciplines, across countries. You exemplify that. So please, in that spirit, talk with me rather than just letting me talk at you. This is, I think, one of the first times I've given a lecture while sitting down. So if I start going like this, just push me back down.
Okay.
So as Enrico mentioned, automated driving has been my primary case study for the relationship between law and technology. since 2011. I call this the law of the newly possible because technology is not new. Individual technologies might be new, but we have always had technology. What's the first technology ever? Anybody? What's the first technology? Yeah, the wheel. Oh, I like that. All right, the wheel, one of the earliest technologies. Can anyone think of a technology that's earlier than the wheel? Even before the wheel? I think the wheel's a pretty good one. How about fire? Is fire a technology? Probably. Language? Is language a technology? I interpret it very broadly, right? Technology are tools, and they can be physical and concrete and tangible, like a wheel, or they can be abstract, like language or banking. These are all technologies. And so law has, from the beginning, had to deal with new technologies. And so much of law is this constant dance between our old precedents and our new technologies, one affecting the other. And so automated driving is a recent and I think a really interesting example of this. So these were some of the first publicly discussed automated vehicles. Google's cars, now Waymo. This was my first class, my first students, and they were the first ones to get a ride. So I'm going to be talking about my thesis, and I'll get to that in a second. But first, I want to ask you a very important question. First important question is, who can hear me? Yeah? Okay. Too loud, too soft? Or just right? Great. All right. The second important question. In your opinion, who or what is the driver of an operated vehicle? Who or what drives an AV or operates an AV? Yes, thank you. Oh, the program itself. So we might call that the automated driving system, that combination of hardware and software, that thing. Great answer. And my federal government has interpreted driver in a lot of its regulations to mean exactly that, the hardware and software. What's another possibility? Or what drives an automated vehicle? Actually, I think it's true. Wow, yes, thank you. Great answer. So some human sitting in the vehicle with some practical ability to intervene or to take over. Yeah, and several states, in fact, the United Kingdom as well, have interpreted driver to mean this, that some person who delegates the driving to the hardware and software, but still in some legal or definitional sense remains a driver. And this is one of the ways that a couple of international treaties RELEVANCE has been involved in are interpreted by some countries to be consistent with automated driving, even though they say every vehicle has to have a driver. What's another possibility? We have the automated driving system. We have some human behind the wheel. Who or what else could be a driver? Another term for these cars is driverless vehicle. So what's another possibility? There's no driver. Yeah, there simply isn't one. And so we ask, well, then how do laws that call for drivers apply? What else were you going to say? Did you say something after that? The manufacturer. All right. So any and all of these answers have a basis in existing law. You give me an answer, I can point to an example from around the world of that definition of driver being used with respect to an automated vehicle. But your last suggestion, the manufacturer, gets closest to my heart, and in fact gets right to my thesis. In my view, there are no self-driving vehicles. There are no driverless vehicles. There are only vehicles driven by companies. Companies that are acting through their human and machine agents to drive the vehicle. And so conceptually, morally, legally, my argument is that we need to treat companies as the drivers. I'll give you one tragic example. Anyone familiar with the crash in Arizona several years ago between a Uber test vehicle and a pedestrian? This was described as the first automated vehicle fatality, rightly or wrongly. A pedestrian was crossing a street, pushing a bike. Uber's test vehicle repeatedly re-identified her. Oh, it's a bike. Oh, it's a person. Oh, it's nobody. And it started over time and time again until it was too late to do anything and it hit her and killed her. There was a safety driver in the vehicle because this was a test system. That driver recently pleaded guilty to a crime for having been distracted while supervising this vehicle. And so we have an automated driving system. We have a human, your two examples, and yet they each failed. Why? It's because when everyone is responsible, no one is responsible. Right? Uber's engineers said, oh, well, the driver will pay attention, so our system doesn't have to be perfect. And the driver said, oh, the system is paying attention, so I don't have to be perfect. The result of that deadly loop was a pedestrian who was killed, a person who was killed. And for Uber, it meant that their automated driving project went away. Uber survived, now they're partnering with Waymo, so go figure. So I want to take you through my argument for why companies drive vehicles. And part of this is descriptive, existing law. Part of it is predictive, how I think law will evolve. And part of it is normative, how I think law should evolve to really entrench this concept. It starts by focusing less on technologies and more on the companies behind them. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the questions I hear every week is, does the public trust this technology? There are surveys right now that purport to say whether people trust automated vehicles. I was talking with several of you beforehand, and you said, right now, I don't trust it. It's scary. Right? So we're really fixated on this question, does the public trust this technology? It's the wrong question. Instead, we should be asking, is the company behind this technology worthy of our trust? There are two steps. Let's go through them. So first, why should we not be asking, does the public trust this technology? Well, we are all fickle. We think we like something, but it turns out we don't. We have 5-second attention spans. What we say to a surveyor isn't at all what we're actually going to do in real life. Words are not actions. The companies behind these technologies have yet to market them to us. And when they decide that they want us to buy them, they will convince a lot of us that we in fact want them and have always wanted them. And a lot changes before 100%. So even if 80% of the public never adopts automated driving, that's still going to be a huge change. Uber, the ride-sharing company, was decimating the taxi cab industry. It was making front page news, was changing how we get around when they represented less than 1% of all vehicles on the road. So automated driving doesn't have to get 100% acceptance in order to be consequential. So what if we asked instead this normative question? Well, should the public trust this technology? And again, that's not a very helpful question because future technologies, by definition, don't yet exist. For 10 years, I had to listen to self-proclaimed experts tell us that the technology is ready, right? We could have self-driving cars now. Who did they blame? Who did they say the reason was why we didn't have self-driving cars on the road? What are all of you currently, or what are you all going to become? What are you all studying? Law. So who did these people blame for why we didn't have self-driving cars? Yeah, lawmakers and lawyers, the law. They said, oh, the technology's ready, but there are too many legal obstacles for a decade. And I kept saying, no, stop saying that. The technologies aren't ready. Now that's flipped. In the last couple of years, we actually have examples of true automated vehicles without anybody supervising them in real time. In San Francisco, in Phoenix, soon in Texas, they exist. And yet now is also the time when so many people seem to be skeptical and pessimistic about automated driving. And I find myself more optimistic than ever. But we can't say that the public should trust something that by and large doesn't exist. Moreover, these technologies are and will be diverse. Different companies, different applications, trucking, robo-taxis. Um, are you familiar with Waymo and Cruise? Did Sven talk about that last time? Yeah. So Waymo and Cruise both were operating in San Francisco until Cruise had a crash that revealed a devastating lack of trustworthiness by the company, that they lied to the public. Before, when both companies were on the road, San Francisco was getting a lot of complaints about both companies. Then, once Cruise removed its vehicles from the road, not only did complaints about Cruise disappear, complaints about Waymo, its competitor, actually went down too. People were so mad at Cruise that they started being mad at Waymo. So these are going to be diverse technologies, diverse companies, for which there can't be a singular assertion of safety or trust. And finally, most of these vehicles won't be super dangerous. Now, that's not a very reassuring statement, is it? Like if I said to you, oh, no, go ahead. It's not super dangerous. Would you do it? What was that? Absolutely. There's still danger. But you know what? There's danger on streets today. And Italy has done a far better job than my country, the United States, in reducing road traffic fatalities and injuries. My country is a sorry outlier among rich countries on that score. But nonetheless, over 1 million people die on the roads worldwide every year. So we should be concerned about automated driving, but terrified about conventional driving. And so if we are paying attention to the status quo, then in fact, being able to say something isn't super dangerous, isn't the standard we should set, but does suggest that this is not going to be a source of incredible new death and injury. Now, I want to caveat that, right? Because there are systematic or unforeseeable dangers that might exist. Cyber attacks on a day when a city is trying to evacuate because of a hurricane and suddenly every car stops. Or long-term systemic consequences. People walk less because they're in cars more and we get less healthy. Or perhaps consequences of the technologies that we don't yet appreciate. I have no reason to believe this is true, but we don't yet fully understand the health consequences of millions of LiDAR beams shooting around our environment all the time. So there will be things that we learn that are unwelcome surprises. And this is the story of technology or law or progress. We take one set of problems, we replace them with a new set of problems, and we just really hope that our new set of problems in aggregate are less than our old set. When the car was introduced over a century ago, people said that it was the environmentally friendly way to get around. It was the green transportation mode. Why? Why were people so happy about the internal combustion engine? What did the car replace? Yeah, thank you. Horses. Anyone ever been on a horse? Anyone been behind a horse? The average horse produces 10 kilos of manure a day. That's a lot of poop. In New York City in 1900, there were 100,000 horses. You can do the math. It was really disgusting. And so the car came along, people said, oh, we've solved our pollution problem forever. Until it turned out we hadn't. We had replaced it with a different pollution problem. And that's the story of technology and even progress. We're never going to get perfect. We're going to get a different set of problems. Now, I will say automated driving has the potential for real-time monitoring and updates in a way that a lot of our legacy technologies don't. So the cars on the road today, we can't update, we can't fix, we may not be able to remove, but automated vehicles will be monitored in real time, will be supervised, will be updated. And so we have the chance to correct dangers and catch and maybe even correct dangers far earlier. Okay, so that brings me then to the question we should be asking. Is the company behind this technology worthy of our trust? Why is that? Well, first, as I've mentioned, companies act through their human and their machine agents. Their human agents are their employees. Right now, there are human drivers driving for truck companies, driving for delivery companies. Those agents are also their machine systems. And automated driving involves both human and machine. And so companies are acting through both their humans and their machines, and therefore it is the company that is acting. Second, technologies are only as safe as the companies behind them. Cruise was effectively kicked out of its markets because it was not a trustworthy actor. Are you familiar about the crash in San Francisco that happened late last year? Did Sven Biker talk about that? Okay, this was the incident. Oh, may I ask actually, what would be your 10-second description of that incident in California involving Cruise? Are you willing? I ask because so often reporters say, oh yeah, I'm writing about where Cruise ran over the pedestrian. Cruise hit the pedestrian. And in fact, if you read news articles, that's the shorthand. Cruise hit a pedestrian. That is the wrong description for two reasons. First, the pedestrian was first hit by a human driver. In fact, a hit and run driver who hit the pedestrian and then sped away. The pedestrian actually bounced into the path of Cruise. And there are questions about whether Cruise should have anticipated that, but by and large, that was kind of an unfortunate crash. Cruise then dragged the pedestrian, and that was a technical failure. That should not have happened. That will not happen again, because now every company is saying, oh wait, do our cars detect pedestrians that are underneath, people who are underneath? So it was an unfortunate failure, but technical failures will happen. The real outrage of that incident, the real moral, is that Cruise misled the public by misleading reporters. Cruise showed a video of the crash in which the pedestrian bounced into the path of Cruise. And then that's where Cruise stopped the video. That's initially what they showed at least one regulator as well. They did not show the part of the video where the vehicle started back up and dragged the pedestrian. That is a failure of the company, because the company effectively did not tell the truth, the whole truth, and then nothing but the truth. And that's why the technology is only going to be as safe as the company. If the company doesn't have a good safety culture, the technology is not going to be safe. And what do I mean by safety? So often we think of safety as just a one-time test. Oh, well, the vehicle has to get approved. In fact, Europe has homologation or type approval for vehicles. We are approving the make and model. Or it's one test, like a driver's test. Oh, I passed my driver's test. We must be safe. That is not an effective definition of safety. Safety needs to be a lifelong commitment. Every time the automated driving system engages, the system needs to be safe. Every minute it's operating on the road, it needs to be safe. From even before the system is designed until 10 years later when it's removed from the road. That's the life cycle commitment of safety. And so in this way, I say safety is a marriage, not a wedding. A lifelong commitment, not a singular event. And only the company can commit to that lifetime commitment. And finally, companies can do right even after their technologies fail. And I'll talk about what that means. Once a car crashes, we've lost trust in that car, but we can still trust the company to do right. So why does safety regulation need this concept of trustworthiness? Not trust, but trustworthiness. Yes, oh, thank you. Of course. I love that.
To their benefit, if they can get it, you cannot our company.
Yeah, so you're saying, Brian, aren't you putting too much faith in companies? And don't we need regulators to make sure that actually things are safe? And I agree. Like, any regulatory system is going to be gamed, is going to be cheated. And so the goal for any regulatory system is to just stay ahead a little. And then when companies figure out how to game that, you change that a little bit and a little bit. And so I am not saying we should rely on companies. I'm saying that we should regulate for the character of companies as a proxy for safety. And let me explain that a little more and see if I can persuade you. And let me know, because if I haven't, that'll be even better. So let's give it a try. Thank you. All right, so first, why can't we just say to regulators, tell us if the technology is safe? Because that would be easy. We just say, well, the regulators should tell us if this technology is safe or not. And then if it is, it's on the roads. And if it's not, it's not. Here's the problem. Emerging technologies are complex, stochastic, and dynamic. Complex, many moving parts, technologically sophisticated. The regulators in the US are just beginning to try to understand artificial intelligence. They will never have the resources to out-hire and out-compete the companies that are developing these technologies. Stochastic or non-deterministic means even if we know the inputs, we can't predict with confidence the outputs. This right here is deterministic, predictable. I know if I press the space button, you're going to go to the next slide every time. That's deterministic. Stochastic or non-deterministic is the opposite. Press the space button, maybe you'll go forward, maybe you'll go back, who knows? AI is, at least by our modern definition, non-deterministic. Anyone know who else is non-deterministic? Not just AI, but yes, we're the best example of a non-deterministic system. I don't even know what I'm going to do, much less what you all are going to do. Like, right, our brains, we convince ourselves that we have intent and purpose. Who knows? We are remarkably unpredictable at an individual level, even if we are somewhat predictable at a statistical level. So for all of the critiques of AI, non-deterministic, uncontrollable, biased, black boxes, all of the same for humans. Unpredictable, uncontrollable, biased black boxes. And dynamic. These technologies are constantly changing. This is an issue right now with European type approval for vehicles, because over-the-air updates mean that the Tesla that you buy is not the same Tesla you have a month later, even a day later. And so if we're trying to approve every iteration, we can't possibly keep up. And we see regulators in the US and Europe really struggling with this right now. So if we try to regulate just the technology, we're gonna fail. We can't keep up, we can't manage it. We need a proxy. Secondly, developers of these systems, the companies, have expertise, information, and access to make lifestyle safety cases. That is, to make an argument. Regulators are not going to get that expertise, that information, that access, even if we try. Third, developers need space for technical innovation. Right? We don't want a one-size-fits-all approach, not even for safety. We don't, just as we would not tell a developer, or you should have a LiDAR unit here and one here and one here, we don't want to tell a developer safety means exactly this. Because once you tell a company what the test is, they're going to game it. They're going to be like Volkswagen and cheat at emissions, or they're going to design not for safety, but to design for the test. And we want companies not to design for the test, but to design for safety. Likewise, regulators need space for regulatory innovation. We haven't yet figured out what the best way is to regulate. We need experimentation and flexibility. And finally, regulators are not going to have all the answers. We simply can't even say yet what it means to be safe, despite a decade of trying to answer that question. But regulators can get better at asking questions, at interrogating companies when they show their vision for safety. So let's go to this question. How safe is safe enough? And I would split it up into two parts. One is retrospective, after a failure has happened, and the other is prospective, before a system has even been deployed. We can also think of this sort of like lagging and leading indicators, if you're familiar with that. The retrospective answer, it turns out, is actually pretty clear in existing law. Retrospective safety means that a system is at least as safe as a human is in the given maneuver. If a human would have seen the pedestrian, the AV has to see the pedestrian. If the human would have avoided the crash, the AV has to avoid a crash. That's basic negligence law in the US. Second, a system needs to be at least as safe as a comparative system. If Waymo's system wouldn't have crashed, Cruise's system can't crash. That's basic products liability law in the US. And finally, this is more normative. A system needs to be safer than the last system to fail, meaning a company doesn't get to make the same mistake twice. You don't get to have the same crash twice. Now, in existing liability law, there are unforeseeable situations, unforeseeable harms. And that means even once the harms become foreseeable, all the vehicles you've already sold are still going to keep encountering that harm, encountering that risk. But over-the-year updates and monitoring and the operational nature of these deployments means that companies will be able to, in many cases, change their system to learn from their mistakes. And so similar to an aviation model, you don't get to make the same mistake twice. So that's, in my view, pretty straightforward. And all the words have been written about the great liability problem, and in my view, is kind of overrun. The much trickier question is prospective safety. Before a deployment, how do we know that something is safe enough if it hasn't even been out on the road? Or even if it's driven just 100,000 kilometers, given that crashes occur, or I'm sorry, fatal crashes occur in the order of millions of kilometers. And so my answer comes back to companies. That safety, reasonable safety means reasonable confidence that the developer is worthy of our trust. We can say the developer is trustworthy, then maybe we can say the system is more likely to be safe. So what does it mean to be a trustworthy company? What should the regulatory expectations be? A trustworthy company does three things. It shares its safety philosophy, it makes a promise to the public, and it keeps that promise. What does that mean? First, a company shares its safety philosophy by saying, this is what we're doing. This is why we think it's reasonably safe. And this is why you can believe us. That is, in engineering language, a safety case. And so a trustworthy company makes a public safety case for why they think that their system is appropriately safe and the evidence that they have for that. So the rest of us can actually critique it. My federal government has tried this 2 administrations ago with asking companies to make voluntary safety assessments. And they started off okay, then they became marketing messages. And that's why we need regulators asking the tough questions, saying, no, I don't understand how you got here from here. Your conclusion doesn't follow your premise. What about this? Could you interpret this data in a different way? And we have examples of that from the regulation of drugs, for example, of experts interrogating a safety case. Second thing that a trustworthy company does is makes a promise to the public. It promises that we market only what we believe to be safe, that we will be candid about our limits and failures, and that when we fail, we will make it right. And each of these should have legal consequence. And then the company keeps that promise by appropriately managing public expectations, not hyping, by supervising the entire product life cycle from development until the vehicle is off the road and in the dump, and by mitigating harms promptly, fully, and publicly. Promptly, fully, and publicly. When things go wrong, they have a public accounting for it, and they address the harm. And so the key here is like a canary in the coal mine, like an early warning system to look for the early breaches of trust, the leading indicators, the things that tell us that that company might not be trustworthy and that therefore their products or services might not be safe. So what are some breaches of public trust? Making hyperbolic claims, saying we have self-driving cars and we don't. Example of, well, let me give you an example of that. Right? Anyone have a Tesla? Anyone been in a Tesla? So Tesla calls its driver assistance system full self-driving. Its full self-driving system requires a driver. That is an oxymoron. So if we can't trust you when you call your system full self-driving, why should we trust you when you call your system safe? In the same way that I can call my umbrella a parachute, but that doesn't make my umbrella a parachute. It just makes my umbrella more dangerous, lest someone actually jump off of a cliff saying, it'll work. So making hyperbolic claims is a sign that a company is breaching public trust and is not trustworthy. Misrepresenting evidence. And there are lots of rumors and speculation that different companies are underreporting and creatively reporting some of their incidents in the United States right now. I'll actually give Tesla some credit in a limited way here. Tesla is probably the most effective reporter of its driver assistance incidents to the US government because of its telematics, that it gets notice of crashes and reports them, whereas some other companies are burying their head in the sand. Failing to update technologies. If a company is not updating its technologies as it learns more, it is not trustworthy. Exploiting the litigation process. This is a big one in the US. I think less so in some ways in Europe. There are some interesting quirks. But a company that uses its superior market power, a company that insists on arbitration that is likely to be very favorable to the company, something that companies are largely allowed to do in the United States. If it uses its power to get a better outcome, it's not trustworthy. Rather than saying, we screwed up, we caused harm, we will pay. And in fact, at least 3 companies, Waymo, Volvo, and Daimler Mercedes have pledged that when their automated systems cause harm, they will be responsible. Now, this is kind of tautological. I too can say when I'm liable, I'm liable. But it's an important statement that should have consequence. And finally, particularly in the US, forcing confidential settlements. This is very typical. Companies will settle, but the condition will be that you are not allowed to ever talk about it. And so the public does not hear about the existence of a settlement. Perhaps they don't even hear about the crash, and they certainly don't know how much the company has paid for it. Basic information that any consumer should know, right? Will my vehicle fail? And if it fails, will the company make it right or not? And yet that's often unavailable. And so a non-trustworthy company forces confidentiality. Right, so how do we regulate through and for trustworthiness? Not just using trustworthiness, but also to encourage trustworthiness. First, as I've mentioned, regulate the company rather than the technology, at least until that fails. And to your point, will that fail? Yes, it will. We'll need a new model in a few years. Legacy companies that suddenly realize they're behind the market and all they have is their reputation, will sell that reputation. A company that's done things right for a long time will suddenly do things wrong. We have examples of that. But no system is perfect. We're looking for second best solutions. It's always the second best solution. Second, expect a company to vouch for its technologies through a public safety case. That we should expect companies to actually tell us why their systems are safe. And then to focus on processes and systems, right? To be able to say, do you have a break the glass plan for an emergency? What is your approach for dealing with first responders? Have you thought about X, Y, and Z? Are you missing important parts of the problem? Identify assumptions and logical progressions. To say, well, isn't your assertion of safety here dependent on the assumption that there will never be a person on the freeway? What if there's a person on the freeway? Or aren't you assuming that a first responder will never need to move the vehicle? What if they need to move the vehicle? This has been an incident, a problem already in San Francisco, where first responders, firefighters have been yelling at cars, saying, move, move. Or they'll try to contact an operator and the operator won't understand and they won't be able to hear the operator. And so being able to ask about these assumptions is an important function of the regulator. Generally, to ask questions and challenge answers. And finally, to target breaches of public trust, to really look at these breaches of public trust as an indication that the company should not be on the road. I think the corporate death penalty is appropriate in the sense of sometimes a company should be put out of business. And that might not be true for mistakes. That should be true for deceit. And so by focusing on trustworthiness, we focus on the capital offenses of a company. So how can law embrace this concept of the trustworthy company? So let me tell you about one of my failures. Several years ago, I was involved in drafting a model bill for US states, for states to regulate self-driving cars. And it was a long process where we involved multiple states and stakeholders and companies and others. And we produced a model bill that was endorsed by the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws, an interstate group that develops these model laws. Any guesses how many states have adopted it? 4. All right. Anyone say more? More than 4? More than 4? I'm like an auctioneer. More than 4 states? Nobody? Appreciate that. It's generous. 0. 0 states have adopted my model bill. Have adopted, right? This prominent group's model bill. Yeah, now some states have borrowed from it, and it's been actually very influential internationally, but no state has yet to adopt it because the manufacturers hated it. They hated it. And that's because this bill says the company is the driver. And the company said, no, you can't say that. The user is the driver. The owner is the driver. That was unacceptable to these participants. They said, no, you can't make the driver somebody who has no ability to do anything. And so we said, we need this automated driving provider concept, an entity that self-identifies to our US state government that represents that the automated vehicle is capable of complying with the vehicle code, right? That's its promise to the public, that our vehicle can follow the law. All of this, by the way, was very carefully crafted, right? They represent that the vehicle is capable of complying with the vehicle code. Not that it always will comply with the vehicle code, not that it always does, but that it's capable of complying with the vehicle code. And the automated driving provider acts as the legal driver from the start of automated operation until a human driver intentionally terminates that operation. So the level 3 systems that you can actually buy now from Daimler, and that have been, that are approvable in Europe under the ELKS regulation. This is a UN regulation for these systems that will perform the driving task in certain environments with the expectation that a human will take over within a reasonable amount of time, roughly 10 seconds after being prompted. Even with this, if the vehicle comes to a stop in the middle of the freeway because the human driver is asleep, well, under this, the company would still be the driver. Why? Because that places the incentives in the appropriate place. On the company that has the ability to vibrate those seats and honk the horn and flash all the lights until the driver wakes up. The company that has the ability to even call the police and say, yeah, sorry about this, our human is asleep. This is a real concern, by the way. In the robotaxi context, one of the biggest problems for the fire department in San Francisco right now is that Waymo will call them up and say, so there's a passenger in the back seat who's probably asleep, but might be dead. Could you go check for us? And so the fire department has to go out, go wake up the passenger. So under this, the company drives, full stop. Company drives until a human intentionally terminates that automated. And this is central to this bill. And I think a lot of companies kind of wish they had taken that bargain at the time, because this is what even companies are now admitting. Waymo, Daimler, Volvo have said it for a long time. Others are coming to the reality that they are acting as the driver. And that has really fascinating consequences for operational safety, right? Because every time an automated driving system engages, it has to engage only when it's safe to do so. Meaning that if a vehicle has a flat tire, if a vehicle has a dirty sensor, if a vehicle has passengers who aren't belted up, if a vehicle is improperly loaded, it is a defect for the automated driving system to engage. And so that takes the safety of individual motor vehicles and suddenly turns it into a systemic question, because a reasonable automated driving system engages only on vehicles that are safe. Okay, so I'm admitting this what is, not a great success. I would have loved to see all 50 states, or even one, endorse this full throttle. But I think that's an important part of the story. And what does a trustworthy company do? Right? It talks about its failures. I'm telling you about one of mine. Happily, though, this has been very influential overseas. Australia has recognized the value of an automated, well, they call it the ADSE, the Automated Driving System Entity. And the UK, early in a law commission report, and now in a bill that has gone through the House of Lords, has gone through the House of Commons, and later this week, yes, in 2 days, we'll get its final reading. A central part of this bill is not the ASD, but the ATSE, the Authorized Self-Driving Entity, ASDE. The Authorized Self-Driving Entity is the automated driving provider. It's the company that acts as the legal driver for these vehicles and that makes certain representations about their safety and their operations. And so the UK, which has in many ways been a leader in legislation, is set to enshrine this principle into law. And I think it will be incredibly influential in how we think about the role of companies in automated driving. So that's my pitch for a trustworthy company and why conversations about automated driving and regulation about automated driving and liability for automated driving needs to focus on this central question of the trustworthiness of companies. I have another set of slides about how some of these lessons from automated driving can be applied to generative AI. How one instance of AI can inform another instance of AI. But let me pause or possibly stop and see if you have any questions or reactions so far. Yes. Yeah.
Companies contacting and sharing information with each other and with different. Why not have this? There we
Yeah.
go. That activities can share with the companies and with the department.
Yes. So my approach is a yes and approach. It's the all of the above approach. Do we need more expertise and access to information among regulators? Absolutely. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And there's an effort to develop some models like that, shared data lakes or pools where companies can report their edge cases, their near misses, their incidents that others can learn from. A lot of this is borrowing from aviation, where there are multiple reporting systems in aviation for companies or even individuals to highlight failures or concerns and learn from them. It borrows from the cybersecurity context where there are companies within an industry that are allowed to share more information than possibly they otherwise would be comfortable, in part for antitrust or competition law reasons, because we want them to share information about cybersecurity incidents. And there are efforts to bring more expertise into government. One of the concerns that exists in the US federal government is there's so much data that the government doesn't know what to do with it. And they don't have the expertise to analyze it or to push it out in a timely fashion. And so when we're talking about systems that are changing every day, there just is not the ability yet, and probably never will be, for governments to be that in tune. To give you an example, the federal government in the US has the Federal Aviation Administration for aviation safety. Air travel is remarkably safe. And the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration for motor vehicle safety. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has about 700 employees total. That is a tiny government office. The FAA has tens of thousands. Should we be like the FAA? Probably. Will we? Probably not. Especially when we have not just automated driving, but artificial intelligence in every sector, in every application, all in our life. There's simply the existing models of regulation will break. Let me give you another example. I really appreciate your question. Imagine that you are a CEO of a company and you find out that there is a problem with your automated driving system. Let's say that you find out that on a certain road, it appears that the vehicle is confusing a bridge and a vehicle, and that this could happen in other places as well. Or maybe it's a cybersecurity vulnerability that hasn't been exploited yet. What do you do? You get the phone call at 4 a.m, we have a problem. You're the CEO, what do you do? You might be that CEO, or you might be the lawyer who calls that CEO, or you might be the first person that that CEO calls. What do I do? Now, in the past, defect investigations, defect processes took months, if not years. You get reports of abnormal crashes. The company would look at them, then they'd figure out that there was a problem, then they would make a notification to the regulator that there was a problem, and then they would come up with a fix, and then they would come up with a plan, and then they would send out mailings to people telling them to bring their cars in to be fixed. And 10 years later, maybe a problem is mostly solved. We're not talking about months or weeks or even days in the situation. We're talking about seconds. What can you do? Well, maybe you shut down the automated driving system. All right, no more automated driving until we figured out what the problem is. Starting now. That means you've stranded some people. They can't get to their doctor's appointments. They can't get home. People will die. Right? If people are reliant on an automated driving system and it goes away, like, people will die. Or people will start driving themselves. How safe do you think it will be if suddenly a bunch of people start driving in conditions that they're not familiar with after relying on vehicles for a year? Not very, right? There will be a lot of human-caused crashes. Do you put the automated driving system in a limp home mode? Like, it will work, but it will only go slow. And suddenly all of the highways slow to a crawl because the vehicles are going 15 kilometers an hour. Do you immediately push a fix? Say, all right, we'll change the code, this line. What's the problem with immediately pushing a fix? What's the history of technology? You solve one problem by creating another problem. You haven't tested that fix. You don't know if you're going to cause a bunch of other problems, if it's going to make things worse. Or you keep things as they are until you've tested the fix, until you're confident, and you push it out, recognizing that there could be a crash caused by this bug in the interim. That's a decision you have to make in seconds. And the regulator, if they're involved, that's going to be yet another level of complication and yet another very slow process. So we're dealing now, and this is, I think, brings us to this idea that we're dealing with technologies that have timelines, that have timescales that are incompatible with human life cycle, with societal life cycles, with regulatory life cycles. Right? The speed of change is simply not something that any of our human or constructed systems can manage. Yeah, thank you for the question. Was it a sort of an answer? Second best. Yeah. Other questions, comments, requests for gossip from the AV world? The person who took that photo of the automated vehicles I showed you was subsequently charged with a federal crime, convicted and pardoned by the former president in the waning days of his administration. Automated driving world is weird. So we could do three things. We could have more questions. We could go through a few slides about generative AI, or we could call it a conclusion. What do you think?
Yes, I think it's
Okay.
very interesting to
Have I teased you?
explore this problem, which is extremely interesting. Yeah, I have a few questions, but I prefer to finish this after this problem, which is extremely interesting, I think.
Okay, let's do it. Go through pretty quickly here. So what can automated driving teach us about generative AI? They are two applications of artificial intelligence. Two very different applications in different ways with different demands, but I think there's some interesting similarities. So first, the status quo is not perfect. We already talked about this, right? That there are legitimate concerns about the safety of automated driving. Those concerns also exist with human driving. And that is so evident in the death toll on our roads. Now, when we're talking about generative AI, there are concerns that arise often about bias, for example, that generative AI systems are going to be biased. And that is a concern. That is a problem that we need to fix. But generative AI systems are like funhouse mirrors. They reflect us back at ourselves. They reflect the world and they distort that reflection. Sometimes they exacerbate problems, sometimes they ameliorate problems, but they reflect our highly imperfect status quo. And so bias, which in the neutral sense of the term is a necessary condition, right? It's pattern matching. It's the very thing that these systems do. And in fact, the very thing that we do. Discrimination, which in its neutral sense is a necessary thing, right? Law draws distinctions all the time. These are neutral terms. They become negative terms when we have invidious bias, invidious discrimination, when certain people are harmed because of assumptions that are made. Well, that exists in our existing system. Your chance of being convicted can depend on the color of your skin. Your chance of being believed can depend on your sex or one's impressions of your sex. Your chance of being paroled can depend on what time the judges considering your case ate lunch. If they're full, they're willing to take risks. If they're hungry, they're gonna be a lot more risk averse. Our existing system is highly flawed. And so as we're talking about the problems of generative AI, we can't forget the problems of our society today. And the opportunities that generative AI has in some ways to make those problems worse, but in other ways potentially to correct those in a more systematic way. We can't control 7, 8 billion people. Perhaps we can better control some AI systems. I've already noted this, right? Progress is all about replacing old problems with new problems. That's the discussion we're having now with generative AI. It will be the discussion we have for time immemorial about every new thing we have, whether it's a physical technology like automated driving, a virtual one like generative AI, or an innovation in law. Just a new set of problems. What else? Hype obscures performance and distorts expectations. Automated driving is much further along the Gartner hype curve than generative AI. Automated driving has already been at the peak of the hype. Everyone said, oh, it's here, it's going to solve everything, it's going to be great. And now we're kind of at the trough. People are disillusioned, saying, oh, we're never going to get it. Generative AI is going to go through that too. Although probably on a very short time scale. And this hype means that we don't properly understand how well or how poorly something performs, and we have unrealistic expectations for it. And this is a pernicious problem in developing, deploying, and regulating these systems. That is, there's a mismatch between what we expect a system to do and what it's actually doing. Next, automation depends on humans. That so much of automated driving right now has depended on human trained models. Ever do one of those captures where it says, pick the photos with a bus, identify the photos with a bicycle, with a traffic signal? Do you know what you're doing? You're training automated driving systems. You're helping them identify things in the real world. And you figure, well, if enough people have the right answer, then it's probably that. You are doing free labor for automated driving and for many other applications. One of the things I've been talking about for years has been the person behind the curtain of automated driving. And I've said, reporters, you need to ask companies how many people are employed for every vehicle you have on the road. Because if it's a driver, it's a one-to-one. But if a company has no drivers in its vehicle, but 4 people involved in maintaining it or monitoring it or providing remote assistance, they're not going to be economically competitive. So automation depends on humans, and this is so much true with generative AI as well. That so much of what we think of automation is actually a human system and exists in a human system. This was most evident in, oh, by the way, this is ChatGPT's example of reflecting humankind back at us. And of course, it's a white man, because that's what we're going to find the most photos of online. The best example of this came from a paper in 1983 by Lisanne Bainbridge. She wrote this paper, then she vanished. No one knows what happened to her. Never heard from again. We think the robots probably got her. But it was a brilliant paper, and it said that contrary to what we expect, the more sophisticated the system gets, the greater the demands are on humans. Because if I'm understimulated, I'm going to get bored, or I'm going to over rely. If I'm overstimulated, I'm going to panic and not know what to do. We need to find this happy medium. And so many of these systems are springing behind the understimulation and the overstimulation. And with automated driving, we already know that people rely too much. With generative AI, we've already seen people are going to rely too much. And even if we say there's a human checking everything, there's a human supervising, they won't. If it's worked for the first 100 times, we're going to assume that the 101st time is okay, and that will be the one that's not. Human systems are fallible systems, and automation depends on humans. Next, existing law is still relevant. This has been one of my earlier hills that I climbed. I heard so many people say, oh, well, automated driving is illegal because there's no law. I said, what are you talking about? Show me the law that says you're allowed to wake up in the morning, or show me the law that shows you're allowed to walk on the sidewalk or eat breakfast, right? We don't, yeah. Yes, yes. Yes, everything is prohibited. Everything is permitted unless it's prohibited. Yeah, very well said. Although I've heard that the saying in Italy is everything is permitted, especially that which is prohibited. So different countries, different approaches. Yes, right. So existing law is still relevant. Just because there's no law specific to automated driving doesn't mean that there's no law relevant to automated driving. In the same way, I've heard people say, oh, automated driving is unregulated. There's no law. Anything can happen. I say, what are you talking about? We have all kinds of law on driving and on motor vehicles. That's still relevant. That still potentially provides us with regulatory tools. Now, there might be inconsistencies, there might be gaps, there might be problems, but we have to start with existing law. That's what I did back in 2011 through 2013, a lot of reading. And came out with the conclusion that at the international level, down to the local level, there was very little that actually prohibited automated driving. And that governments already have a lot of tools to regulate for the safety of it. And similar with generative AI, we've already seen how copyright law has suddenly become incredibly important. We didn't need new law. We had to look at existing law and refine and interpret that existing law. So how do we interpret this existing law? So the lesson here is that interpreting existing law involves soft law, legal fictions, and legal creativity. Every system is involving what I would deem legal creativity. We're giving a little wiggle room. We're smudging a little. We're cheating a little when it comes to law. I'll give you a few examples. First, at the international level, we have 2 treaties that say every vehicle has to have a driver and all drivers at all times shall be in control of their vehicles. We modified one because it was easy to amend. The second one will never be amended. It's too hard. And so every country has come up with their own way around that. My view is that there is still a human driver, or there is still a driver, and we can find one. That's what the UK said as well, following my recommendation. Other countries say, oh, well, the hardware and software is the driver, and that fits in our legal system. Others say, no, 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 there's only a human driver, but that old treaty is too old for us to pay attention to. Is that legitimate international law? Can you say, oh yeah, well, that old treaty, we just don't want to follow that anymore? No, right? You're bound to the other parties and haven't signed the new one. But some countries say that anyway. Everyone finds their own legally creative approach to get through this problem. Our federal government in the US has done a very good job of, to your point, getting more information from companies about incidents. Not analyzing information, but getting it at least. This is the standing general order that said, hey, companies, you just need to give us information. That was using existing tools. In Arizona, the state of Arizona has had some of the most automated driving activity for years. And yet for years, there was no statute specific to automated driving. It was already allowed. The governor instead issued an executive order that said, hey, here's what companies need to do. No legal basis for that executive order, none whatsoever. If something's legal, the governor can't just unilaterally restrict it. But everyone followed the rules because they wanted that legitimacy. So with generative AI, we're likewise going to see lots of legal creativity and legal fiction about who the creator is, about whether there was fair use, but whether there's patent infringement. We're going to get through these things in kind of a messy way. It's not as clean as we might like to think law is, because law is never that clean. So what are some of these questions that are going to arise in law? The first is how automation is conceptualized. So are humans the designers, the users, the subjects, or the elements of these systems? Are the applications of AI products or services? There's a legal import to that distinction in the US, actually in Europe too, under the products liability regulations. Are they agents? Agents of a company, agents of a human user? Are they instruments, instrumentalities, or are they legal persons? No. Right? These are all potential different conceptualizations of automation. Next, we focus on the technology of the company. You already know my view on that one. See if I persuaded you. And how do we navigate the boundary problems? So let's say that we're conceptualizing automation as a discrete actor in some sense. Well, is a vehicle one robot, 100 robots because of all of its sub-sensors, or 1/1,000,000th of a robot because it's controlled centrally along with lots of other vehicles? If we all have embedded AI, or we're relying on our phones so much, how are we distinct from another person? How do we draw these lines in a increasingly connected world? Second, key legal question involves presumptions and burdens of proof. Are we saying that a developer must prove safety? This is often the European approach. Or that the regulator must prove danger. This is often the US approach. And this has been a central problem in so many EU-US disputes. What we start, where our default assumption is, how the precautionary principle or approach fits in. Remember at the UN, both sides wanted to say that regulation needed to take account of science. The US wanted to say that because they didn't want regulation until we were sure of things. Europeans wanted that because they wanted regulation until we were sure of things. So we came up with this fudgy language that said the parties recognize the importance of scientific knowledge to regulation. Each side interpreted that completely differently, but everyone was happy because they got what they wanted. But it's going to be an ongoing problem. Where do we start? What is the effect of uncertainty? Right? If we're unsure, if we're not confident, does that push in one direction or the other? And so much uncertainty is present in all of these issues. Engineering and law both have defaults. Right? They both have this idea of where do we start? And if we don't know, what do we default to? And this is the other really important question. Right? What are our defaults and what are our deviances from this? So I've already told you that My view is companies drive vehicles. But I'm having a hard time extrapolating that to generative AI. Because in the automotive context, I can see how companies have complete control over everything. They decide whether a system should be updated, whether it should be engaged. But is that appropriate in the context of generative AI, where we have all kinds of users with their own goals? And maybe we don't want that kind of centralized control over these systems. And in fact, the generative AI tool should be an agent not of the company, not of the designer, but an agent of the user. It's a very different approach for a different domain. In asking about defaults and deviances, we need to consider, is the goal appropriate? Are the means appropriate? What is our goal and are we achieving it appropriately? To not just talk about responsibility. That's a term that's thrown around frequently. Who is responsible or what's responsible? It doesn't help us any. Because responsibility is a moral question, a legal question, a technical question. Even within law, responsibility can be ex ante or ex post. It can be criminal, civil, or administrative. And so instead, we should talk in a much more nuanced way about the default authorities or restrictions or obligations or liabilities. This is the language and concepts that allows us to actually have informed discussions about what we mean. Another example of this is, the dispute about rights. Should there be a right to repair, where anybody can go and demand that their system be changed in a way that they want it to be, without having to rely on the company that sold it? Or should there be a right of contract, where we all have the ability to agree to those kinds of restrictions? So a lot of the disputes, I think, are going to come down to these underlying questions of what are our defaults and when and how might we deviate from them. And finally, a lesson, in my view, from automated driving that will apply very much to generative AI and other forms of AI is that we obsess so much about the distinction between human and machine. Is it human? Is it machine? But in my view, we should talk much more about centralized versus decentralized systems, centralized versus distributed systems, because centralization might be more significant than automation. This is a photo I used, I promise you, before the recent bird flu crisis. But in the 1800s, we all lived pretty close to farms, and so we all had cows. And we would drink the milk from the cows, and if the milk was bad, we'd die. But it would just be our family. And so we solved that by taking all the milk, collecting all the milk, bringing it all together and delivering it to factories where the milk was pasteurized to kill any dangerous pathogens, which is great. It made our milk much safer. Except when things go wrong, it's not just the farm family that's dead, it's hundreds or thousands of people. This is the central conflict with centralization. We can control more, but when things go wrong, they really go wrong. And the question becomes, who is we? Who is the we that's doing the controlling? And so this is, I think, going to be the key question for our future of artificial intelligence. And that is the question of power. Who is empowered and who is disempowered? Companies, governments, individuals, maybe even animals. One of my research interests is ways that we might use AI tools to empower other collectives, whether it's formal unions or whether it's more informal amalgamations of people who have common interests or perhaps common visions of privacy, who can come together in some automated way and create a market or a constituency or a pressure group that otherwise they never could have formed. And so for automated driving, for generative AI, and I think for artificial intelligence generally, these are the questions that we're going to face, along with all of the ones that I can't possibly anticipate, because again, progress is all about replacing old problems with new problems, answering old questions by asking new questions, and that will certainly be true here as well. It's also one of the reasons I'm so happy to talk with you all, because you are going to be the lawyers and scholars and thinkers who are going to ask and answer all of these questions. So good luck to you all.
Thank you very, very much for this speech, which was exactly as we dreamt. So, right, brilliant, interesting, and full of many, many things to discuss together now, but also in the future, and absolutely multidisciplinary. And so I was impressed by many things. If you like to give some question or doubt, you are obviously the first one to be heard. And so, first of all, I like to see you, but if we have time, we also have to discuss other things. But if you have any curiosity or doubt, please, you can also like to come here or do tell me something. We are ready for this.
Recognizing the outstanding questions that some of you have already asked.
Somebody wants to ask something, or can I do you like to discuss? No, first you. No, okay. No,
She's asked so many good questions already.
Okay.
Yeah.
so I started with one. I was extremely impressed by one thing. So the idea of safety during the entire life cycle, because this is both a question which bring us to the past and push us to the future. First of all, to the future, we are approving now the regulation on the AI in Europe. And one of the key points is the continuous monitoring of the things. So it's exactly compliant with this idea. We can say safety is not like a picture, but it's a movie, which every second is different compared with the past. But also we get back to the past because, as you mentioned, one idea was a sort of ante-litteram monitoring developed by Volvo in the 50s, when they studied case by case, every accident which happened to cars everywhere in the world. And this was the idea, which you did underline very well, to compare the safety designed for test and the safety for the real life of the car. So this is a kind idea of an ante-litteram idea of monitoring and safety, and so how to get the trust of the consumer. Another very interesting thing is something like that. I heard something about the reasonable trust of the consumer in the new technology. I think is on the other side, the other phase of the precautionary principle. So the idea is this is new. I do not completely trust this. And so I need to know that it is reasonably safe, even if I'm not completely sure. So this was very interesting because I think it's like a dark side of the precautionary principle or a light side of this. Lastly, very interesting was the idea that we have the wish to shift the liability from the human being inside the car to the producer. This is very interesting, I think, because it's the key to get the trust of the consumer for this technology, to know that somebody is capable to pay in case of accident. And one very last thing is very interesting, your article, driverless cars are probably legal. It's very interesting because I always tell a tale which is extremely personal, but I think extremely significant. My grandfather was one of the first Italian drivers when cars were surrounded by horses and there were no safety rules, no road rules, no anything. And so at that time, he was exactly in the position in which is now a driverless car. So there were not rules, but on the one hand, it was not illegal because nobody was perhaps illegal. It's just it was completely new. And so for 2 decades, he drove in an environment which was completely without any rule. And the only rule was the common person, average person knowledge of this. So this is a plenty of many interesting things on which we can start many research paths for the future. So thank you very much for all this, but I prefer to leave you the floor because your doubts are more interesting, I think.
Yes.
But I think take into consideration the dangers that cars like this automated driving cars can be controlled or modified. And in potential terrorist attack, they can get into the systems to control those cars. And someone will use it but all the Teslas start driving themselves on their own limitations and we might punish each other. Or maybe even worse, in possible like if we have these type of cars on the street, possible terrorist attack, by getting this car and driving to killing of people. Like, do we have? We also are going to take into consideration that we are now comparing machines in this, but are also considering machine the machine can others. Are we considering those dangers when creating this system?
Yeah, thank you both for your wonderful comments. I really like the expression movie rather than picture. I always say marriage rather than wedding. I think that captures the three-dimensional nature too. And connecting the two is how you were describing shifting liability away from the human who's most proximate to the institutional actors that can really make a difference. This is the history of product liability. And it's fundamental to the safe systems approach for traffic safety, where we say, look, if we expect the human driver to solve everything, that's a brittle system and people are going to die. We have to look upstream and say, how could the vehicle be safer? How might the infrastructure be safer? How could our entire system be more resilient? And when we talk about this long tail of risk that you described, whether it's cybersecurity incidents, whether it's just the use of technology as a weapon, like no fancy hacking, just putting in a bomb and driving it, or whether it's other kinds of systemic failures, like just a failure during an evacuation or novel situation, or I mentioned LiDAR or poor health outcomes, all of these long tails that are different from the risks we have today, and therefore less likely to get analyzed correctly. So there's a bit of a technical answer and a legal answer. The legal answer goes to, well, how does it fit into this? Like, if one of those incidents happened, how would we analyze it? And we could apply, I think, this three-part and say, well, did the system perform as well as a human? So would the human have been hacked? Well, maybe, maybe not. Would this human have been able to deal with this novel situation, right, where suddenly the police are saying, everybody drive in one direction, drive the wrong way, just go, right? Get away from the hurricane. And then we can, that's basic principles of negligence. What is reasonable? What is reasonably foreseeable? And what are the reasonable measures that one takes for those reasonably foreseeable risks? Or we could apply the products liability framework, which I paraphrase here as at least as safe as a comparative system. But that would be, in legal context, a plaintiff saying, well, here is the design change that would have prevented this harm without making the system less safe overall. So right here is the design change that would prevent this cybersecurity vulnerability. or the more resilient fail-safe operation that would have prevented the system from suddenly turning 90 degrees or accelerating to 4G, right, beyond any reasonable envelope. That is a design that would have been a fail-safe or fail operational or more flexible and forgiving. Because that's what we need, whether it's the source of the problem is a cybersecurity problem, a mechanical failure, or intentional human misuse, systems that are forgiving and that are not brittle and snap at the first vulnerability. And that'd be the second. And the third would be safer than the last system to fail. Well, we already had a disclosure of this 0-day vulnerability, so you have to have patched it. Or we already had this one of these incidents, so you don't get to have it again. So that's how I would apply those legal concepts. But that's again retrospective. And I think so much of your question is the prospective. We know these could be problems. How do we deal with them in advance? And that's true of any technology. We know that humans will misuse it, even if we haven't figured out how. We know that there will be cyber vulnerabilities. And that's true not just of automated vehicles, but of today's vehicles, the majority of which are connected. If I wanted to cause you to crash, I suppose I could come up with an elaborate way of attacking the vehicle's steering and braking. But you know what? It'd probably be easier for me to target your radio. It's probably not as well protected. Telematics for infotainment is a long-standing area of deployment. And I bet I could make you crash by cranking up the decibels to 150 decibels. Right? You'd be on the freeway suddenly. What's that noise? You'd crash. Right? Simple. So we have these things today. And it's really important that we think about them in the way that you are. And so much of this field is coming up with those unforeseeable things and making them foreseen. Yeah. Thank you. That's actually the stage systems approach of going upstream, and just what you're describing.
Okay, so if we have no other question, I think we can finish this lesson also because we have just few minutes to be inside because at 7 p.m. this building is starting to close. But before, if you like, we can have a sort of picture as a memory of this outstanding lesson. And so we can finish the lesson. We thank very, very much Brian Walker-Smith, which was extraordinary. And I hope this is the first very lesson in the That's it.
So much.
Finish now.